Venezuela chose the wrong target in the Caribbean. Big mistake.
Let me take you back to January 9, 2024, a date that, at first glance, seemed like just another flare-up in the long-simmering border dispute between Venezuela and Guyana. That was the day Nicolas Maduro's government issued a decree claiming sovereignty over Essequibo, a vast, oil-rich region that makes up two-thirds of Guyana's territory. The move was bold, provocative, and if you believe the mainstream narrative, just another example of Venezuela's reckless, authoritarian overreach. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying Latin American geopolitics, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this wasn't just another territorial spat. This was a strategic blunder of historic proportions, one that could reshape the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. And if we don't understand why, we're going to sleepwalk into a crisis that could have consequences far beyond the Caribbean.
Now, let me be I'm not here to defend Maduro.
His government is corrupt, repressive, and economically incompetent.
But that doesn't mean we should accept the official narrative at face value. Because what's happening in Essequibo isn't just about Venezuela's territorial ambitions. It's about something much bigger, a high-stakes game of great power competition, energy security, and the slow-motion collapse of American hegemony in its own backyard. So let's start with what they want you to believe. The official A David versus Goliath story. If you've been following the news, you've probably heard some version of Venezuela, a failing state under crippling U.S. sanctions, is desperately trying to distract its population from economic collapse by manufacturing a crisis with tiny, oil-rich Guyana. The story goes like.
In December 2023, Venezuela held a referendum where 95% of voters supported annexing Essequibo. Never mind that the turnout was suspiciously low, or that the question was phrased in a way that made opposition seem treasonous.
The result was Maduro had a mandate to reclaim what Venezuela has long considered stolen territory.
The Venezuela's claim to Essequibo dates back to the 19th century, when the region was part of Gran Colombia. After independence, Venezuela inherited the dispute, but in 1899, an international tribunal awarded the territory to British Guiana. Venezuela has never fully accepted this ruling, arguing that it was rigged.
The new Guyana's oil boom.
Since ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore reserves in 2015, Guyana's GDP has grown by over 60% in a single year. The country is now the world's fastest growing economy, and Essequibo sits right in the middle of the most lucrative oil blocks. Venezuela, meanwhile, has the world's largest proven oil reserves but can't even refine gasoline for its own people. The temptation to grab a piece of Guyana's windfall is obvious.
The U.S.
The Biden administration has framed this as a clear-cut case of aggression. The State Department issued strong statements condemning Venezuela's actions.
The U.S. Southern Command conducted joint military exercises with Guyana.
And in April 2024, the U.S. announced it would hold routine air and naval patrols in Guyanese waters, a move that, in diplomatic terms, is the equivalent of a shoulder tap followed by a hard shove.
At first glance, this all makes sense.
Venezuela is a rogue state.
Guyana is a small, democratic ally. The U.S. is standing up for the little guy.
Case closed.
But there's a problem with this narrative. It's too clean.
It ignores the geopolitical chessboard. And most dangerously, it assumes that the U.S. has Venezuela's number, that Maduro is just another tin-pot dictator who can be swatted away with a few sanctions and a sternly worded press release.
That's not just wrong. It's dangerously wrong. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the most obvious why now.
Venezuela has claimed Essequibo for over a century.
So why is Maduro making his move in 2024, at a time when his country is weaker than ever? The answer isn't just about oil. It's about survival. 1. The sanctions trap. Since 2019, the U.S. has imposed crippling sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry, cutting off its primary source of revenue. The goal was regime change, starve Maduro of cash, force him out, and replace him with a U.S.-friendly government. But here's the thing about they rarely work as intended. Instead of collapsing, Maduro adapted.
He turned to Russia, China, and Iran for economic lifelines. He allowed the black market to flourish. And most importantly, he weaponized the sanctions themselves, using them as a rallying cry to consolidate power.
The message to Venezuelans was the US is trying to destroy us. We must stand together. But by 2024, even that narrative was wearing thin. Inflation was still in the triple digits.
Millions had fled the country. And Maduro's approval ratings were in the gutter. He needed a new distraction, something big enough to rally nationalist sentiment and justify his continued rule.
Enter Essequibo. 2. The Guyana a proxy war in the making. Here's where things get interesting. Guyana isn't just a small, helpless neighbor. It's a US proxy, and a critical one at that. Since ExxonMobil's discovery, Guyana has become a key player in America's energy security strategy. The US sees Guyana as a counterweight to Venezuela's oil reserves, a way to reduce dependence on Middle Eastern and Russian energy. And the Biden administration has made no secret of its support for Guyana's territorial integrity. But here's the Guyana's military is tiny. Its entire defense budget is smaller than what the US spends on one F-35 fighter jet. If Venezuela really wanted to take Essequibo, it could. So why hasn't it? Because Maduro isn't stupid. He knows that a full-scale invasion would trigger a US military response. And that's the last thing he wants. So what's really happening? 3. The US, not Guyana. Let me tell you something that most analysts won't say. Maduro's move in Essequibo isn't about Guyana. It's about the United States. Here's the Step 1. Manufacture a crisis, hold a referendum, issue a decree, and create the appearance of imminent conflict. This forces the US to respond, which in turn allows Maduro to play the victim. Step 2. Leverage the crisis for sanctions relief. Venezuela knows that the US doesn't actually want a war in the Caribbean. So Maduro's real goal is to use the threat of escalation as leverage to negotiate sanctions relief. Think of it as a high-stakes game of lift the sanctions, or we'll make things messy. Step 3. Play the great powers against each other. Venezuela has spent the last decade cultivating relationships with Russia, China, and Iran. If the US pushes too hard, Maduro can always turn to Moscow or Beijing for support, just as he did when he invited Russian nuclear bombers to Venezuela in 2018. This isn't speculation. It's classic asymmetric warfare, the kind of strategy weak states use when they can't compete militarily. And it's working. Because here's the dirty little: the US is trapped. If Washington does nothing, it looks weak. If it escalates, it risks a quagmire. And if it lifts sanctions to de-escalate, it rewards Maduro's aggression. That's the real reason this is a big mistake. Not because Venezuela can't take Essequibo, but because it's forcing the US to reveal its hand, and the hand isn't as strong as Washington would like us to believe. The X did geopolitical the Caribbean as a battleground. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana. It's about something much: the return of great power competition to the Western Hemisphere. For the last 200 years, the US has treated Latin America as its de facto sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a warning: stay out, or else. And for most of the 20th century, it worked. The Soviet Union tried to challenge US dominance in Cuba and Nicaragua, but it never really threatened America's backyard. But today? The rules have changed. 1. The return of the Russians. Russia and China have spent the last decade making major inroads in Latin America. And Venezuela is ground zero. Moscow has been Venezuela's most reliable ally since Hugo Chávez's days. It's provided weapons, economic aid, and even nuclear-capable bombers for training exercises. In 2023, Russia announced it would open a new military base in Venezuela, a move that, if completed, would give Moscow a permanent foothold in the Caribbean. Beijing has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, effectively bailing out Maduro's regime. In 2023, China and Venezuela signed a 25-year cooperation agreement, part of Beijing's broader Belt and Road Initiative. And let's not China is also Guyana's largest trading partner. So while the US is backing Guyana, China is hedging its bets. Now, here's the key: what happens if Venezuela escalates in Essequibo and the US responds militarily? The Russia and China will exploit the crisis. Russia could send military advisors to Venezuela, just as it did in Syria. It could deploy its navy to the Caribbean, forcing the US to divert resources from other theaters. China could use the crisis to strengthen its economic leverage over Guyana. It could offer to mediate the dispute, positioning itself as a responsible great power while the US is bogged down in yet another conflict. This is how great power competition works in the 21st century. It's not about direct confrontation. It's about exploiting local conflicts to weaken your adversary. And right now, Venezuela is handing Russia and China the perfect opportunity. 2. The US. Hegemony versus overstretch. The US is facing a classic imperial how do you maintain dominance when you're already stretched too thin? Military the US is still fighting wars in the Middle East. It's supporting Ukraine against Russia. It's deterring China in the South China Sea. And now it's supposed to also police the Caribbean? Economic the US national debt is over $34 trillion. Defense spending is at record highs. And yet, the Pentagon is still struggling to modernize its forces. Adding another front in Latin America would be extremely costly. Diplomatic the US is losing influence in Latin America. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia are increasingly asserting their independence. Even traditional US allies like Argentina are flirting with China. If the US overplays its hand in Venezuela, it risks pushing more countries into the arms of its rivals. This is the real reason the Essequibo crisis is so dangerous. It's not just about a border dispute. It's about whether the US can still enforce its will in its own hemisphere. And the answer? Not as easily as it used to. Military and strategic the illusion of a quick fix. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because if you listen to some of the hawks in Washington, you'd think this was a slam dunk, send in the Marines, scare off Maduro, and call it a day. But anyone who thinks that is dangerously naive. 1. Venezuela's weak, but not powerless. Venezuela's armed forces are a shadow of what they were in Chavez's heyday. Corruption, brain drain, and lack of maintenance have degraded their capabilities. But that doesn't mean they're toothless. Asymmetric Venezuela has spent years preparing for a US invasion. It's trained militias, stockpiled weapons, and developed cyber warfare capabilities. If the US intervenes, Venezuela won't fight a conventional war. It will fight a guerrilla war, one that could drag on for years. Russian and Iranian Moscow and Tehran have both provided Venezuela with advanced weapons, including drones and anti-aircraft systems. If the US attacks, Venezuela could retaliate with cyber attacks, sabotage, or even proxy attacks on US interests in the region. The Cuba playbook. In 1962, the US nearly went to war with the Soviet Union over nuclear missiles in Cuba. Today, Russia has already deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela. If the US escalates, Moscow could respond by sending more advanced weapons, raising the stakes to nuclear levels. 2. The US military's limitations. The US military is the most powerful in the world. But that doesn't mean it can do anything. Logistical Venezuela is not Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a coastal nation with dense jungles, urban centers, and a population that hates the US. Any invasion would require massive logistical support, something the US is already struggling to provide for Ukraine. The American people are exhausted by forever wars. Another conflict in Latin America would be extremely unpopular. And in an election year, Biden can't afford another foreign policy disaster. If the US gets bogged down in Venezuela, China could use the distraction to make a move on Taiwan. The Pentagon knows this. That's why it's very reluctant to escalate. 3. The escalation how this could spiral out of control. Here's how this could go. 1. Phase 1, US shows of force. The US conducts military exercises with Guyana, deploys warships to the region, and issues stern warnings. Maduro responds by mobilizing troops near the border. 2. Phase 2, limited strikes. If Venezuela does invade Essequibo, the US might launch airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets. Maduro retaliates by attacking US oil facilities in Guyana or sabotaging the AMA Canal. 3. Phase 3, Great Power Involvement. Russia sends military advisors to Venezuela. China offers to mediate.
The US is now in a proxy war with two nuclear-armed powers.
For Phase 4, the unthinkable: if the US pushes too hard, Russia could deploy nuclear-capable assets to Venezuela, just as it did in Cuba in 1962. At that point, we're one miscalculation away from a direct US-Russia confrontation. This isn't fearmongering. It's realpolitik. And it's why the US cannot afford to underestimate Venezuela's gambit. The domestic political why Biden can't back down. Now, let's talk about the real reason the US is so invested in this politics. 1. The Florida factor. Florida is the most important swing state in the 2024 election.
And Florida's Latino vote, particularly Venezuelan and Cuban exiles, hates Maduro.
If Biden looks weak on Venezuela, he risks losing Florida to Trump.
The exiled Venezuelan and Cuban exiles in Florida are highly organized. They've spent years lobbying for tougher sanctions on Maduro. And they will punish any politician who appears soft on his regime.
The Trump has already accused Biden of being weak on Venezuela. If the US doesn't respond forcefully to Maduro's aggression, Trump will use it as a campaign issue. 2. The Democratic Party's dilemma. The Democratic Party is deeply divided on Venezuela.
The figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have called for sanctions relief and diplomatic engagement. They see Maduro as a symptom of US interventionism, not the cause. Though the Biden administration is caught between these two factions.
On one hand, it doesn't want to escalate.
On the other, it can't afford to look weak.
This internal division is paralyzing US policy. And Maduro knows it. 3. The 2024 election looms. Here's the bottom: Biden can't afford to lose Florida. And that means he can't back down on Venezuela, no matter how risky the situation becomes. This is the real reason the US is so invested in the Essequibo crisis. It's not just about Guyana. It's about domestic politics. And that's a terrible reason to risk war. Scenario: how this could play out. So where does this go from here? Let's look at the three most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case, diplomatic de-escalation.
In this scenario, the US and Venezuela engage in back-channel negotiations.
The US offers limited sanctions relief in exchange for Maduro backing down. Guyana agrees to some form of resource-sharing deal with Venezuela to save face. The crisis fizzles out. Maduro gets a temporary economic lifeline. The US avoids a quagmire.
Maduro could use the sanctions relief to consolidate power, making him harder to remove in the long run.
Scenario 2, the most likely, controlled escalation. In this scenario, the U. Scenario 2, the most likely, controlled escalation.
In this scenario, the US responds to Maduro's provocation with a mix of military posturing and economic pressure, but stops short of direct conflict. We've seen this playbook before. Think of the 2019 naval exercises near Venezuela, or the 2020 deployment of US warships to the Caribbean under the guise of counter-narcotics operations. This time, the Pentagon might send a carrier strike group to the region, conduct joint exercises with Guyana, or even pre-position special forces in neighboring countries like Colombia or Brazil.
The message? We're watching, and we're ready. Now, what most people don't realize is that this kind of controlled escalation is exactly what Maduro wants. Not because he's suicidal, but because he's playing a longer game. Every time the US flexes its military muscle in the region, it reinforces his Venezuela is under siege by imperialist forces. That's political gold for a regime that's spent the last decade blaming Washington for its own failures.
It also gives him cover to crack down on domestic opposition because, of course, dissent is just another form of foreign interference.
Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The Caribbean isn't just Guyana's backyard, it's a critical choke point for global trade.
The U.S. Southern Command has been sounding the alarm for years about China's growing influence in the region, from deep-water ports in Jamaica to satellite tracking stations in Argentina. Russia, too, has been making inroads, with its Wagner Group mercenaries operating in Haiti and its navy conducting joint exercises with Venezuela. If Maduro's gambit succeeds in destabilizing Guyana, it won't just be a win for Caracas, it'll be a win for Moscow and Beijing, too.
And that's something the US can't afford to ignore. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is already stretched thin. The Pentagon is still grappling with the fallout from Ukraine, the Middle East is a powder keg, and China's shadow looms over Taiwan. The last thing Washington wants is another front in its backyard.
But Maduro's move forces its hand. If the US doesn't respond, it risks looking weak not just to Venezuela, but to every ally in the region who's watching to see if America's security guarantees are worth the paper they're printed on.
Scenario 3, the worst case, unintended escalation. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. It's not that Maduro wants a war with the US, he's not that reckless.
But history shows that miscalculations happen, especially when you've got a regime that's desperate, paranoid, and surrounded by yes-men. Imagine Venezuela conducts a military exercise near the Essequibo border, and a Guyanese patrol boat gets too close.
Shots are fired. Maybe it's an accident, maybe it's not. Either way, Guyana calls for US support under the Rio Treaty, and suddenly, you've got American troops on the ground. Now, the US has been down this road before.
In 1983, Grenada's Marxist government invited Cuban and Soviet advisors to build a runway that Washington feared could become a forward operating base.
Reagan didn't hesitate, he sent in the Marines.
The operation was over in days, but it sent across this line, and we will act.
The difference today? The stakes are higher, the region is more volatile, and the US public is far less willing to tolerate another foreign intervention.
But here's the: Maduro isn't just playing with fire, he's playing with a nuclear match. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it was in the 1980s, but it's still the most formidable force in the Caribbean. It's got Russian-made Sukhoi jets, Chinese anti-ship missiles, and a network of irregular forces, colectivos, Cuban advisors, and even Hezbollah-linked operatives that could turn any conflict into a guerrilla nightmare.
And let's not forget the oil. Venezuela's refineries are within striking distance of US Gulf Coast facilities. A single well-placed attack could send gas prices soaring just in time for the 2024 election.
The real danger isn't that Maduro will win a war, it's that he'll lose one badly, and in the process, drag the US into a quagmire it never wanted.
That's how these things spiral.
Look at the US went in to topple the Taliban, and 20 years later, it was still there.
Look at a quick regime change turned into a decade of insurgency. Maduro knows this.
He's betting that the US won't have the stomach for a prolonged conflict, especially not in an election year.
And that's a bet he might just win. The broader geopolitical fallout. Let's out for a moment. Venezuela's move on Essequibo isn't just about Guyana, it's about the future of the Western Hemisphere. For decades, the US has treated Latin America as its backyard, a sphere of influence where it could call the shots. But that era is ending. China is now the top trading partner for most of South America. Russia is selling arms and spreading disinformation.
Iran is cultivating allies in Nicaragua and Bolivia.
And Venezuela? It's the canary in the coal mine, a country that's openly defied US hegemony and survived.
What Maduro is testing is whether the US still has the will to enforce its red lines.
If he gets away with this, it won't just be Guyana that pays the price.
Ecuador, Peru, even Brazil, all of them will start hedging their bets, looking for ways to appease Caracas, Moscow, and Beijing rather than risk Washington's wrath. That's how empires not with a bang, but with a series of small retreats that add up to a strategic defeat. And then there's the military angle. The US has spent the last 2 decades preparing for great power competition with China and Russia.
But what if the next war doesn't start in the South China Sea or Eastern Europe? What if it starts in the Caribbean, with a miscalculation over a disputed border?
The Pentagon's war games have already simulated this scenario.
The results aren't pretty.
In one 2020 exercise, a conflict with Venezuela quickly escalated into a regional crisis, with Russia and China exploiting the chaos to extend their own influence. The US won on the battlefield, but lost the strategic initiative.
Here's the bottom: Maduro's gamble is a symptom of a larger problem. The US is no longer the undisputed hegemon in its own hemisphere. And as its influence wanes, its adversaries are testing its resolve. The question isn't whether the US can still project power, it's whether it can do so without getting bogged down in another endless conflict. And right now, the signs aren't encouraging. What happens next? So where do we go from here? The most likely outcome is Scenario 2, controlled escalation.
The US will send warships, impose new sanctions, and maybe even greenlight a covert operation to destabilize Maduro's regime. Guyana will get a temporary boost in military aid, and the crisis will fade from the headlines until the next provocation. But don't mistake this for a solution. Maduro isn't going anywhere. The sanctions have failed to topple him, and the opposition is too divided to pose a real threat. The only way this ends is with a negotiated settlement, one where Maduro gets to stay in power, but has to make concessions on oil, elections, or both. That's the deal the US has been trying to broker for years. And it's the deal that Maduro has been skillfully avoiding. The real losers in all this? The people of Venezuela. They're the ones who will pay the price for Maduro's recklessness, just as they've paid for every other miscalculation his regime has made. And the people of Guyana, who now find themselves on the front lines of a geopolitical struggle they never asked for. As for the US? It's caught in a trap of its own making. Decades of interventionism have left Latin America deeply suspicious of Washington's motives. But decades of neglect have left the region vulnerable to outside influence. Now, the US is scrambling to reassert its dominance, just as its adversaries are circling. Maduro's move on Essequibo isn't just a mistake, it's a symptom of a world in transition. And in that world, the old rules no longer apply. The question is whether anyone in Washington is paying attention. Now, what most people don't realize is that Maduro's gamble in Essequibo isn't just about oil or territorial ambition, it's about survival. Not Venezuela's survival, mind you, but his own. The man is a political animal, and like all autocrats clinging to power, he operates on a simple when the domestic situation becomes untenable, manufacture an external crisis. It's a classic play from the authoritarian handbook, and Maduro has been running it for years. The difference this time is that he's picked a fight he can't win, and in doing so, he's exposed the rot at the heart of his regime. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's economy is in shambles not because of US sanctions, though they certainly haven't helped, but because of 2 decades of socialist mismanagement, corruption, and outright theft. The numbers are staggering. Since Chavez took power in 1999, Venezuela's GDP per capita has collapsed by over 75%. Inflation, once a manageable problem, spiraled into hyperinflation, peaking at an eye-watering 1,000,000% in 2018. The bolivar, once a stable currency, became so worthless that people used it as kindling or wallpaper. Today, the minimum wage in Venezuela is less than $4 a month. $4. That's not a typo. A country sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves can't even afford to feed its people. Now, you'd think a crisis of this magnitude would have toppled any government. But Maduro has held on, and the reason is he's not governing, he's surviving. His regime has perfected the art of repression, co-optation, and divide and rule. The opposition is fractured, with key leaders either in exile, in prison, or co-opted by the regime. The military, the real power behind the throne, has been bought off with control over lucrative smuggling routes, gold mines, and drug trafficking operations. And the people? They're too busy trying to find food, medicine, or a way out of the country to mount a sustained challenge. But here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's grip on power is weaker than it appears. The economy is a zombie, kept alive by a mix of Chinese loans, Russian arms deals, and Iranian sanctions-busting schemes. The military's loyalty is transactional, not ideological. And the international community, while divided, has made it clear that Maduro is a pariah. The Lima Group, the EU, and even some of Venezuela's traditional allies in Latin America have recognized Juan Guaidó as the legitimate leader. The problem is that Guaidó, for all his moral authority, has no real power. He's a president without a country, a symbol without a movement. So why pick a fight with Guyana now? Because Maduro is running out of options. The 2024 presidential election is looming, and for the first time in years, the opposition has a real chance to unite behind a single candidate.
Maria Corina Machado, a hardline anti-Chavista, won the opposition primary in October 2023 with over 90% of the vote. The regime has already disqualified her from running, but that hasn't stopped her from galvanizing support. The streets of Caracas, Maracaibo, and Valencia are buzzing with a level of political energy we haven't seen since the 2017 protests. Maduro knows that if he allows a free and fair election, he loses. And if he loses, he faces the same fate as every other Latin American strongman who overstayed his exile, prison, or worse. That's where Essequibo comes in. By stoking nationalist fervor over the disputed territory, Maduro is trying to do two things. First, he's creating a rally around the flag effect, hoping that Venezuelans will prioritize territorial integrity over bread and butter issues. It's a cynical ploy, but it's worked before. In 2007, Chavez used a similar tactic to distract from his failed constitutional referendum. In 2013, Maduro himself leaned on anti-American rhetoric to consolidate power after Chavez's death. The script is when the economy collapses, blame the gringos, the oligarchs, or the traitors within. Second, and more importantly, Maduro is testing the waters for a full-blown electoral fraud. The December 3 referendum on Essequibo wasn't just about the territory, it was a dry run for the 2024 election. The regime claimed that over 10 million people voted in favor of annexing Essequibo, a number that's mathematically impossible given Venezuela's current population and voter turnout rates. Independent observers, including the Venezuelan Electoral Observatory, called the referendum a sham, with reports of multiple voting, intimidation, and outright fabrication. But the message was if Maduro can get away with rigging a referendum, he can get away with rigging an election. The problem is that this time, the stakes are higher. The opposition is more organized, the international community is more engaged, and the Venezuelan people are more desperate. If Maduro steals the 2024 election, he risks triggering a mass uprising. The 2017 protests, which left over 100 people dead, were a warning. The 2019 blackouts, which plunged the country into darkness for days, were another. Maduro knows that if he pushes too hard, the military might finally turn on him. That's why he's hedging his bets. By escalating the Essequibo crisis, he's giving himself an off-ramp. If the election goes badly, he can declare a state of emergency, suspend the vote, and blame it on foreign interference. If the protests get out of hand, he can crack down and claim he's defending the homeland from imperialist aggression. But here's the Maduro's strategy as a house of cards. The military's loyalty is not absolute. The generals may be corrupt, but they're not stupid. They know that if Venezuela becomes a pariah state, their assets abroad will be frozen, their travel restricted, and their families targeted. The rank-and-file soldiers, many of whom are barely scraping by, are even less reliable. In 2019, there were reports of desertions and mutinies. In 2020, a group of soldiers allegedly tried to assassinate Maduro in a drone attack. The regime has responded with purges, but the cracks are showing. Then there's the international dimension. Maduro's allies Russia, China, Iran are not the reliable partners they once were. Russia is bogged down in Ukraine and can't afford to prop up another failing regime. China, which has lent Venezuela over $60 billion since 2007, is getting impatient. The loans were supposed to be repaid in oil, but Venezuela's production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to less than 800,000 today. Iran, which has sent technicians to help restart Venezuela's refineries, is facing its own economic crisis. These countries are happy to use Venezuela as a geopolitical pawn, but they're not going to bail Maduro out if things go south. So what happens next? Let's game out the scenarios. Scenario: the status quo holds. Maduro muddles through. He rigs the 2024 election, declares victory, and doubles down on repression. The opposition fractures, the protests fizzle out, and the international community imposes more sanctions, most of which are easily circumvented. Venezuela becomes a failed state, but Maduro stays in power. This is the most likely outcome, but it's also the most unstable. A country can't function indefinitely with hyperinflation, mass emigration, and a collapsed infrastructure. Sooner or later, something gives. Scenario: the military steps in. The generals, sensing that Maduro is becoming a liability, stage a coup. They promise a transition to democracy, but in reality, they're just replacing one strongman with another. This is how most Latin American dictatorships end, not with a revolution, but with a palace coup. The problem is that Venezuela's military is deeply politicized. The top brass are Chavistas to the core, and they have no interest in ceding power to civilians. So where does that leave us? In a stuck. Venezuela is in a holding pattern, and the only way out is through a negotiated settlement. The problem is that neither side has an incentive to negotiate. Maduro knows that any deal that involves him stepping down is a death sentence. The opposition knows that any deal that leaves Maduro in power is a betrayal. And the international community is too divided to impose a solution. The most likely outcome is that we muddle through for another few years, with Venezuela lurching from crisis to crisis. Maduro will stay in power, but his regime will become increasingly brittle. The economy will continue to deteriorate, the emigration crisis will worsen, and the country will become a haven for drug traffickers, arms dealers, and other criminal elements. Eventually, something will give, whether it's a coup, a revolution, or a foreign intervention. But by then, the damage will be done. The real tragedy is that Venezuela's crisis was never inevitable. This is a country with vast natural resources, a well-educated population, and a rich cultural heritage. It could have been a regional powerhouse, a beacon of democracy and prosperity in Latin America. Instead, it's a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when ideology trumps pragmatism, when corruption goes unchecked, and when leaders prioritize power over people. Maduro's move on Essequibo is just the latest chapter in this sad story. It's a desperate gamble by a desperate man, and it's doomed to fail. But the cost of that failure will be borne by the Venezuelan people, who have already suffered enough. And that, more than anything, is the real crime.